Okay, welcome back to Plato's Cave, the first episode recorded in Houston, Texas. And joining me today is Manuel Vargas. Manuel is a professor of philosophy at the University of California, San Diego, and his research focuses on the overlap of moral, psychological, and legal issues concerning human agency and freedom. He also writes about contemporary Latinx philosophy and the history of Mexican philosophy. So, Manuel, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's always great to be on a podcast that focuses on the history of philosophy in Mexico.
That's right. Unfortunately, that's not this podcast.
Sorry. No, but it is great to be here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation, and I'm excited to be your inaugural Texas guest.
Yes. We don't have the right hats on for this episode. We need different headgear for this.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, so actually, yeah, I Latinx and Mexican philosophy is honestly something that I'll be the first to admit I know quite literally nothing about. I don't know if there'll be an opportunity to take any classes about that at Houston, but if so, I'll definitely have you back on for for another episode. um, but no, so we're talking about a fairly different topic today. Your view on free will and moral responsibility, or at least one of your views on that set of topics, revisionism, which I'll admit, I'll butter you up at the beginning of the episode. When I started reading about the view, I was disposed to be not a hater, but definitely skeptical of the view. And you very much turned me towards at least I would say I'm revisionist adjacent at this point. So congratulations on that victory.
Well, welcome to the dark side. I mean, the dark side of the force has a distinctive power set, and so I, encourage everyone to try it out.
Yeah. So, if you would just for people who may not be familiar at all with the view, I mean, generally, like, this podcast talks a lot about free will and moral responsibility, but what specifically is revisionism when it comes to those topics?
Yeah. So I think oftentimes the best way to think about what revisionism about free will and moral responsibility is like starts by thinking about things that are completely disconnected. So forget everything you know for a moment about free will. Let's say just pretend the topic doesn't even exist. One of the things I think that is just familiar from the long arc of the history of science and the long arc of the history of human cultures and human forms of self-organization is that we change our mind about things over time. So take the kind of the view that people had at one point in time about water, for example, being one of the four basic indivisible substances of the universe. And over time, we eventually came to have the chemical theory of water, and then this changed our understanding about what water is, or similar kinds of things with the miasma and germ theories of disease. But this isn't just about scientific phenomena. It's about like everyday real world phenomena. So criminal law and the common law tradition, for example, didn't care about intentions up until about the 12th century. And so in the 12th century, there was this innovation in legal practice where the thought is, well, whether or not somebody's guilty or not, maybe we shouldn't think about this in a strict liability way. Maybe we should be trying to discern and track what people's intentions are. And so this was a kind of transformation in the understanding about what the basis was of legal guilt. And so I think this sort of phenomenon happens all over the place where we come to change our minds about what the nature of something is. Most recently, maybe in the United States, the kind of really salient version of this is marriage. I think, the poll data seems to suggest that 30 years ago, a lot of people took it as almost a conceptual truth, or maybe in fact a literal conceptual truth, that marriage had to be between a man and a woman. And I think it's there remains disagreement about this today, but there's widespread acceptance of the idea that in fact not only is the possibility of gay marriage possible, but same-sex marriage in fact is actual and legally recognized now. And so that sort of phenomenon is the general kind of phenomenon that I think of as revisionism about some or another phenomenon. And I think that's the right thing we should think about the nature of free will and moral responsibility. That is, I think we can identify ways that we thought about these things that are embedded in a long and complicated cultural history, but that some combination of scientific and philosophical reflection has given us reason to change our minds about important aspects of that. And then the result is that I think a good or satisfying philosophical theory is going to have the result that it will conflict with aspects of everyday common sense, at least up until the point at which we fully take it on board or have internalized it. And maybe in some sense it persists indefinitely. And I think there can be cases of that too, where it turns out there's phenomena, think about light being both a particle and a wave. It's really hard for the layperson to wrap their head around how that could possibly be true. But I think, maybe free will ends up being something like that, where the right theoretical account is always going to be sort of uncomfortable when considered from the standpoint of everyday understandings of it. But I think that's the general shape of the class of view that I've been trying to articulate and get people to see the possibility of, that we could go in for a theory of free will that will be at odds with or conflicting with aspects of common sense, but that B might have something appealing to be said for it, where it's not just a mere conceptual possibility that we could have a theory like that, but that there are good reasons to think we should actually adopt and hold that kind of theory.
That makes sense. Yeah. I don't think I mentioned this at the top, but just for people, I know I mentioned it to you, but so I'm kind of reading you as you appear in the Four Views on Free Will book from 2007, which is a fantastic book. But
there are three great chapters and one ugly one in there. So that last chapter, the fourth chapter, I think is a weak one, but the first three are tremendous. And the response chapters are interesting too, but really the first three chapters are terrific.
Yes, it's the fourth is a bit of hogwash. The first three are the baby in the bathwater. But I also I know we talked about this over email, but also so like if you differ from what you said in the 2007 book, I'd actually be really curious to hear about that too. So don't feel like you have to kind of conform to like the 2007 version of you. So if I'm reading and hearing you correctly, there's two aspects to revisionism, generally speaking. There's the descriptive part, which is that, our current theory is saying X, and then there's the prescriptive part, which is saying that, well, actually, we need to revise our theory of whatever it is to be something different than X. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So think of I think a lot of theorizing runs together these two different components, what I sometimes call descriptive or diagnostic theorizing and prescriptive theorizing. And part of seeing the possibility of revisionism requires disentangling these things. So it's the idea that we can get an account of how it is that we tend to think about something. That's the descriptive diagnostic portion. And then there's the question about what, all things considered, ought we to believe going forward. And the revisionist says the prescriptive theory is going to be in conflict with the diagnostic or descriptive theory.
That's right. And I was wondering if there seems to be implicit sort of a third premise there. And I was wondering if you would agree with it explicitly. So there are those two premises too, but then there also has to be this additional sort of desire to retain a certain, label for a belief or an idea or a proposition too, right? Because if you could imagine just those first two premises could entail an abandonment of the first term. But you actually also have to want to retain that verb or phrase or noun or whatever it is in specific, right?
So I guess I've been inclined to think that the prescription is in some sense baking in that idea.
Okay.
So the idea is the prescription is how ought we to think about and then X, whatever the X is, whether it's a concept or a referent or a meaning, a property. And so depending on what we're talking about, we might want to regiment the language in different ways here. But I think so I was thinking of this as built into the prescriptive element. And then there's a further question. And this is something that I think this is maybe one thing that the difference between the 2007 version that is in the Four Views on Free Will book and then sort of post 2013 versions of the view that I prefer. That I think there's been, I think we've got those of us who are sort of inclined to revisionist theorizing are a little clearer about something very closely related to this issue you're asking about, which is that you might then think that there's a further question to be asked once you've done the revisionist theorizing, and that's about whether or not we should retain the notion that once we have what we take to be our best, all things considered version of that kind of thing, it might turn out that the very best theory of phlogiston ends up still being a theory that we should reject. And so I think that you're rightly picking up on there's a further question here we could ask. And I mean, I think one of the things that's emerged in the conceptual engineering literature, which I think is talking about many of the same kinds of things that were animating the revisionist project. And I think it's just one of these funny artifacts of the way in which philosophy unfolds, that you have parallel discussions happening in different literatures where people aren't picking up on or interacting with the discussions that are happening in other domains. But I think one of the things that the folks who've been thinking about conceptual engineering, qua conceptual engineering, have rightly pointed our attention to is that that you could think that there are a bunch of different constraints that are potentially available for guiding whether or not we retain the concept or the term across, as it were, theoretical transitions. And so one thing that might, one way to put it is think of it in terms of the question of topic continuity. When is it that we're still talking about the same topic? And it might be that for different kinds of terms, there are different constraints on what constitutes topic continuity. So are we talking about retaining the practices? Are we talking about retaining a normative justification? Are we talking about retaining conceptual content? All of these things might provide different sorts of constraints on how it is we think about those answers to the question about what's the relationship between the diagnostic and the prescriptive, and then the retention questions.
Okay. Yeah, that's one of my like kind of first critical questions about the view is that, so like in the book you have the three analogies that you draw. So there's, water, marriage, and magicians. And I thought it was interesting because all three of those kind of have like a different degree of social constructionism, right? So if you look at water, for instance, like I'm wondering if there's a way in which that analogy is a little bit actually disanalogous to something like free will. Because with water, for instance, everyone agreed on what we were trying to describe. It's not as though people were pointing at, dirt and saying like that's water. No, we were pointing at the same thing. And yet it was just these kind of like theories, I guess you could say, about water that were different. And we revised to what we think is the correct one, right? But I'm wondering, like if that necessarily holds for something like free will, where it seems like, you know, so I guess my question to you is like, how much of this hinges on, it seems like there's a real disagreement about the phenomenon that we're describing, not just what we call it. So for instance, libertarians are of a certain strain are positing some like contra causal ability that we have, whereas compatibilists and hard determinists both, roughly speaking, agree on what sorts of abilities we might have, and then it comes down to how we want to think about them or how we want to talk about them.
So, okay, so a couple of thoughts. So one is, I mean, I think you're right to raise the question about disanalogies between the water case and the free will case, and I do think there are interesting and relevant disanalogies in that particular case. Though I guess I was thinking of the water and the magician case and the marriage cases at the outset of the that chapter in the Four Views on Free Will book as intended to motivate a certain kind of possibility. That is, that we could, that there's grounds to think that we could go in for revisionist theorizing, and that it's not just a sort of ad hoc motivation in the context of free will, but rather it's a kind of thing that we do in lots of different domains. So it's not a weird project to take up this project in the case of free will. So that was the kind of the primary work I was thinking it was doing. But even so, you might still think, well, okay, but that's just to grant that it's a possibility. We still might have reasonable questions about whether or not, say, the revisionism about free will looks more like a water case, where maybe there's a natural kind that we agree about what counts as in the extension, versus cases where maybe we disagree about what counts in the extension, as in like marriage cases. So, think about the massive amounts of disagreement about what constitutes marriage. So you go and you do ethnographic work and you see cross-culturally hanging out with anthropologists, and there can be mating practices, but do all mating practices count as marriage practices? Well, if you're hanging out with a group of Catholic priests, they're going to say, no, not all marriage practice, not all mating practices count as marriage practices. There's the sacramental relation that obtains under certain kinds of conditions. And if it doesn't obtain, then it's not really in the true and deep sense marriage. And so you can have those kinds of disagreements about what falls into the extension of relatively familiar words around us that I think are going to be a little closer to the free will and responsibility cases. Even though note, as we noted here at the outset of the discussion, that even though we've had robust disagreements about what falls into the extension of marriage, it's also true that we've changed our mind, and relatively clearly changed our mind repeatedly over the history of the deployment of that concept. Now, one thing you could think is, well, but part of the worry is that some people think about free will as a practice independent, metaphysically antecedent phenomena in the universe that's going to be closer to a natural kind rather than a social kind. And so the kinds of flexibility I'm talking about are flexibility bound up in the kind of dynamics of social practices. So if you had that thought, you might worry about the marriage analogy not being particularly compelling.
Mm.
But then I think, it doesn't take a lot of trundling around in the history of science to find examples even in kind of broadly natural kind literatures where people are arguing about whether or not something was whether or not something was caloric or not, and so there's just kind of disagreement about what was falling in the extension. So I think we get those same kinds of disagreements, but we just have to be careful about what examples we're selecting and which properties we think are the ones that are distinctive of the kind of problems that we're looking at. So that's not a full answer, but I think it's a partial answer to the kind of the worry you're raising.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. Yeah, I think the way I'm kind of viewing it is it might be the case that compatibilists and hard determinists kind of team up a little bit in the sense of going after libertarians as saying, this natural kind of phenomenon, they're going to unite in saying that doesn't exist. And then I think the more label oriented or term or language oriented disagreement then maybe reemerges between the sort of Dirk Parabooms and yourself, for instance.
Yeah, good. So, so I think here I want to be cautious,
Mm,
because in some moods anyway, I'm inclined to think that we've had a bit of mystification by labels in the free will and responsibility literature. So, so one of the things I guess I'd want to say about libertarians is that it might be true that there are disagreements among some parties about whether or not the forms of agency that libertarians think are necessary for free will and moral responsibility. There are going to be some people who disagree about whether or not we have those things. And I think that there are real and substantive disagreements there. That seems to me a different disagreement than the question about whether or not those forms of agency are required to justify our practices of, for example, holding one another to account.
mm,
And you could think something like, well, it's not that I think that libertarianism is impossible or even that it's necessarily implausible. I might just be agnostic about whether or not we have agency like that, and think like this is going to be a question for future science. If it turns out our best models about how the human mind operate turn out to be stochastic or indeterministic models, and no amount of sciencing it up ever gives us anything like a deterministic account of how the mind and human decision making works in kind of morally salient decisions. That maybe future science just never gives us that, and we get to the end of time and maximal science has been done, and it just turns out like, well, shit, the libertarians were right all along
yeah.
about what the metaphysics of agency was like. That's certainly possible. But I think in some sense that's going to be unresponsive to at least one wing of concern in this literature, which is about not the question about like, is it plausible the universe is built in one way rather than another? It's the question about what's the minimal or the thinnest or the barest requirement
Mm,
on us holding one another to account, or being able to rightly use the term free. So it could turn out that we do have libertarian agency. It just turns out the libertarian agency isn't what's required in order to be free and responsible.
okay. No, that I buy that. Yeah. That's why I guess this is it's related but a little bit tangential. You from what I seem to understand, you and many people do this, and I guess I've always been a little bit confused as to why the literature looks this way. A lot of people sort of in the responsibility debate define free will as the condition required for moral responsibility. And I guess I naturally kind of tend to think about it a little bit differently in the sense that like it just seems like when we do that, are almost deflating free will a little bit in the sense that it just sort of comes along with responsibility. But I always thought about free will as like the question of um, what abilities or types of freedom or types of agency do we have, irrespective of whether responsibility follows from that. I don't know if you have
What
an
do you mean by
opinion on
freedom?
that. What do I mean by freedom? Like what? Good question. By freedom, I mean sort of like what sense of unconstrained action can I take? So, like, do I have access to the forking paths, for instance? Like, do alternate possibilities really metaphysically exist in some way? Um, like, could things have gone differently had the clock been rewound or whatever? And I guess I've always thought about free will as a concept a little bit differently than just being the precondition to moral responsibility. Um, I don't know. Like, do you think that that's like do you agree with that at all, or no?
Yeah, so I think that one of the chronic um, the chronic points of submerged disagreement in the literature has to do with the framing of these questions. So this is a kind of methodological point or a metaphilosophical point about the subfield, and I think this is a claim I'm going to be completely unable to substantiate, but I'm just going to just assert it with confidence that that when it feels like a lot of the basic views and foundational views in a literature are talking past each other, that's oftentimes a symptom that that the debate is elsewhere and that there are just foundational metaphilosophical disagreements that are shaping how the debate's going that people aren't focusing on or talking
Mm.
about, which is why it can make it sense of the or this it's why it can sometimes feel as though you've got ships passing in the night. So I think one of the areas in which ships have been sometimes passing in the night in this literature, and I don't think it's universal. It's not that nobody's ever talked about these things at all, but I think it's in the ways in which we think and talk about these things in an intro free will class, for example. Oftentimes we don't directly talk about this set of issues. So here's a set of reactions to the general thought that you had, and so sometimes I paint this as a kind of disagreement between those who are metaphysics first and those who are normative theory first. But I do think this is a useful heuristic for keeping track of what I think is at the end of the day even a more complicated debate than that. But at the level of this heuristic, it goes something like this. You've got to decide what your priors are for your theorizing. Like, what are the things that you're taking as foundational? And there are a group of folks who think something like, look, we have a relatively good grip on a prior and antecedent notion of freedom that plays no functional role elsewhere, but that we can just as it were, from the armchair, provide a characterization of what it is. And then we can go out and ask questions about whether or not realizations of that broad concept are more and less plausible. And we can have a fight about it. But we can start from a kind of metaphysics first phenomena and then go in and fill in the details. And
Mm.
then there are folks who are inclined to think, well, we can generate all kinds of metaphysical exotica and abstracta from the armchair. And the question is, why should any of those abstracta have any demand on our thinking or grip on our philosophical theorizing or count as at all related to everyday discourse? Because you and I can invent all sorts of metaphysical possibilities in this conversation
Mm.
that have no connection to everyday conversation. I mean, this is the Dan Dennett point about the truths of Schmesh, is that we could have elaborate theories about how to go about doing strategy in a game that is just like chess, except the horse has a slightly different move than in the actual world's version of chess. And so there would be a lot of truths we could articulate there. But I think the normatively minded folks have tended to think we've got to anchor our metaphysics in something else. It's a metaphysics tied to something else that drives it. And then a lot of those folks have thought, well, look at the tradition, look at where people are talking about free will and moral responsibility. And very, very often, those things are linked, right? It turns out in Kant that free will is significant in large part because of its connection to responsibility and culpability. In the religious tradition, that's tied into the problem of evil and as a kind of resolution to the problem of evil. Look at Nietzsche and his characterizations about free will and why he thinks, he's a kind of eliminativist about free will. Why does he think it was ever invented? It's an
Mhm.
answer. It's tied into social practices of credit and debt. And so I mean, there's a long philosophical tradition that goes the kind of what I'm characterizing here as the broadly normative way, that the metaphysics has to be hooked into a set of practices. But there's also a real tradition of people thinking, no, maybe there's a kind of independent metaphysical specification we can give. Okay, so that's a first pass. A slightly complexifying version of this story says, well, maybe that's a little too quick on the characterization of the metaphysicians. So here's a set of things that the metaphysicians could think are tied into real and relatively concrete things. It's just not social practices of culpability. So here are among the things. So when we first person deliberate, it looks like we have open possibilities in front of us. Do we have true beliefs about ourselves when we're deliberating about what we can do? So there's a notion. Here's another notion that looks like it might come apart from the deliberation notion. Sometimes we're interested in the question about whether or not I was ultimately the source of an action in the causal order, some unique causal origin point that is discrete and not merely a product of what happened previously. Now, notice that is not about first-person phenomenology. It's not about questions about whether or not the beliefs I had about myself when I was deliberating were true. And it doesn't look like it's necessarily got to be tied into practices of culpability and blame. And I think we can go and spell out more and more of these different kinds of notions. There might be explanatory notions. So like Gunnar Björnsson and in work with some of his collaborators has argued that we have an interest in explaining action, and action explanations will sometimes generate pressures to identify some things as central to the explanation and not. And it's our demands and interest in kind of trying to identify what explains why certain kinds of events happen. So there's a kind of explanatory framework thing that looks like it's different than the question about, as it were, genuine causal origin, and maybe different than the question about first-person deliberative standpoints. So I think, notice by the time we get done doing all of this and we start to spell out all of these different kinds of framework things, then what counts as a good theory and a theory responsive to the data starts to look really different.
Yeah.
Now, that's a long setup to the punchline, which is, I do think that there are diverse versions of the free will problem running around out there. I think it's a mistake to think there's a single free will problem, as some folks have liked to say. And I think that hint that there's a bit of philosophical imperialism going on is when somebody says things like, we were clear about what the free will problem was, and then other people came and screwed it all up. And it's like, well, no, look at the thousands of years of people talking about versions of this problem, and they're interestingly distinct versions of these things. And it's not clear that. So that's the sense in which I'm skeptical. There's a single problem here. I think there are multiple problems, and the best we can do is to be clear about what the specific problem is that we're interested in, and then it might turn out some of the resources that we're using over here turn out to be useful over here. But I think maybe it's fair to say a plurality of the literature, both contemporary and historical, has thought that the version they were concerned to give a response to was one tied into culpability practices. But I think it's important to think, or it's important to recognize that is not the only set of problems lurking here. And you could think we have a good answer to that without thinking we have a good answer to the problem of evil, or having a good answer to the question about causal origin, or about first-person deliberation, or ...
Okay. That explanation alone was worth the price of admission for me. I had always there was that, the way you phrased it there was extremely illuminating to me. So thank you for that. I realized I took us down a little bit of a rabbit hole though. So returning to
well, we are talking about the free will problem. It's all rabbit holes.
That is true. And it's a lot of talking past rabbit holes, as you pointed out. That actually, yeah, I'm going to think about that explanation a lot with respect to maybe like semi-compatibilism in particular as well, because that's a view I was very drawn to. So going back to your kind of proposals put forth in the book. So you and I, from what I understand, this is something you've also slightly changed your mind on a little bit. When we're going back to that discussion of what we currently believe, juxtaposed to what we should believe, the view you put forth in the book is that our current notions of free will are incompatibilist, and then within that, libertarian. And is that something that you have slightly changed your mind on?
Yeah, so I think these days I'm inclined to be a little more cautious about these things. So I think one of the things that we learned or ought to have learned from the past 20 years of people doing broadly experimental philosophy,
Mm.
or psychology that is responsive to the interests of philosophers. So those two enterprises, I think, have made it clear that it's very difficult to make good on sweeping generalizations about what and how people think, and especially about sort of theoretical constructs, because of course, given that the theoretical constructs are themselves contested, it's not clear how we can reliably suss out what ordinary commitments are on these theoretical constructs, and so that there's challenges in everything, it challenges in everything, and challenges to the literature from which I'm going to draw from here, but I've become persuaded that the right way to think about it is that there is a significant chunk of some relatively local us, where the relatively local us includes, as I think I put it in some place, NATO countries and their allies, that tends to hold that the nature of free agency of a sort that might matter for things like culpability will oftentimes, but not universally, have something like broadly libertarian commitments.
Mm.
And crucially, I think it can be variegated and context sensitive. So that is, it might well be that we just have a mix of commitments. That is, under some conditions, we're prone to thinking more like libertarians, and in other conditions, we're more prone to thinking like compatibilists, and in maybe some conditions, we're prone to thinking like eliminativists. And different kinds of conditions can plump our intuitions in those ways. And so that's the sense in which I think here I'm uncomfortable these days asserting that everybody, or that the vast majority, are thoroughgoing incompatibilists and thoroughgoing libertarians in particular.
Mm.
I think it's more like many of us some of the time are libertarians, and that's all it takes to have the free will problem be a longstanding, gripping problem. And I think it's also part of what's explanatory in why there's been such protracted and sustained philosophical dispute about this. I think it goes something like, folks get exposed to this at some point in college. They go off to graduate school. They have a really charismatic or really not charismatic presentation of one or another view. And during the whole process, they might have some wayward intuitions over here, wayward intuitions over here, but then they get trained up to know how to respond to those ones and to suppress these ones here. And the charms of regimenting these intuitions rather than those intuitions begins to do its work. And then, a few years in, you have dogmatically committed folks for whom they will defend the party line at all costs against the heathens and apostates of the other view. And I think that the reason why that happens is precisely because we do have
Mm.
divergent or mixed intuitions from the get-go, that ordinary common sense isn't so completely overwhelmingly decisive in one direction or another. It has to be that it's rich enough in its ability to support distinct kinds of theorizing, that's where I think we end up with this kind of situation.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it would be frankly amazing if folk intuitions perfectly aligned with one notion or theory or another, given that, like these theories have been refined and cultivated by many people over many, many years. So like it would be statistically improbable for that to be true. But no, I do, yeah, I definitely, not having like run any X5 studies myself, but just like, from the armchair or out in the world, I do agree that most people, I would say most of the time, tend to be libertarian leaning. And so in that sense, I guess I was sort of, I told you like I was agreed with you more than I thought I would. And I think I've always sort of been like I was revisionist without knowing it, in a sense that, if you simply do disagree with what the current theory holds, and you think that we should retain the term in some way, shape, or form, then you do kind of find yourself in the revisionist crowd. Um,
That's
so
right.
yeah.
And I mean, for what it's worth, I'm inclined to think that um, that a lot of historical compatibilist theories are probably they were not crafted as intentionally revisionist theories. So I think lots of folks, think about all the fights about the conditional analysis of Can. The shape of these arguments were arguments about like, no, 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 the ordinary meaning of Can is, and then insert the conditional analysis. And this is why it was viewed as a kill shot when these examples came out about the breakdown of the conditional analysis of canon phobia cases. Why was it a kill shot? Well, it was a kill shot because it was supposed to be representing everyday ordinary notions. So I think there's a long strand of compatibilism that saddled itself with the constraint of trying to represent and understand or articulate what it took to be the common sense view. But I also think there are other compatibilists who were running around who, whether or not they had the kind of ready vocabulary to talk about their theories in those ways, were either moving in the direction of or tacitly helping themselves to the possibility that, well, no, this is a kind of theoretical transformation of our understanding. It's designed to replace the folk, everyday, crude, non-philosophical account. That's what the work of philosophy is to do, is sometimes to overturn everyday convictions. And of course, there's a long contested history here about like what the proper scope of philosophy is, and whether or not revisionist projects are always dead in the water, and whether or not we should think of as philosophy as exclusively a defense of common sense or something else. So, I mean, big, and this is the sense in which I think large metaphilosophical disputes here are lurking on the underside of the free will problem, and part of the explanation for its absolute refusal to die.
Hmm. And yeah, this was so that is touching on something that I once again, you sort of illuminated this point that I realized I had been thinking about, but not explicitly in these terms, when you differentiate between weak revisionism and moderate revisionism. And so you say, to see the difference between weak and moderate revisionism, reflect on the difference between, on the one hand, what the folk think, and on the other hand, what the folk think they think. And so that's where I guess a really big difference between you and a compatibilist like John Martin Fisher, for instance, would kind of get teased out is Fisher seems to almost be thinking that what the people think they think is wrong, and we can just kind of scoot them a little bit towards what they really deeply think in some sense, and that happens to be the correct theory, whether it's any type of compatibilism you like. But you're sort of biting the bullet in some sense and taking the slightly harder lined view and saying, no, what the people think is just wrong. Like, we just do need to, in a lot of ways, like reform people's beliefs about these things.
Yeah, good. So here I want to be careful, and I'll leave to John Fisher the defense of his own account and how he thinks it is best understood. But I do think that weekly revisionist accounts, the way I was employing the distinction there is exactly as you were characterizing it, and I think this is what a lot of compatibilists have taken themselves to be committed to. It is a kind of weak revision where the thought is something like, what the revision is supposed to be is just we're helping the folk see what they were committed to all along. And it's not that the folk were mistaken, except in their understanding of themselves. But once you understand what the actual core commitments are, it turns out they really there was nothing problematic about the core commitments. The only thing that was problematic is their understanding of what those core commitments were. And I think that's the kind of classical compatibilism where the thought was something like, no, libertarians are introducing confusions that make people get confused about what it is that all they ever really meant by these terms. And so I do think, so I do think that there have been a lot of compatibilists who were thinking in that vein for sure. But now I guess, and so this is, one of these ways in which I think it partly depends on how you think about or what one's characterization of revisionism is. There are reasons to think that the weak versus moderate revisionism, it's not that it's not picking out something, but if you think of revisionism as the prescriptive is in conflict with aspects about common sense, and that's a relatively scalar notion, you could think something like, well, that the compatibilist accounts aren't really in conflict with common sense. What they're in conflict with is common sense's self-construal.
Hmm.
And that's the sense in which it's a kind of a relatively weak variety of revision and probably not worth the name.
Yeah. That's the weird thing was I now I don't know if this is just idiosyncratic or if I was skimming over paragraphs or something, but I always read compatibilist accounts as being, or at least like I interpreted them as the more moderate revision-esque, where they were almost saying like we don't really care what the folk think. We're trying to prime like you, the philosophically sophisticated readers, intuitions with like this variation of a Frankfurt example or whatever. Um,
Well,
but
I think sometimes that was going on. I mean, this is
yeah.
this is one of these things where I think so to speak flatly, um, lack of clarity about what the different and distinct options are and what burdens they carry
Hmm.
has meant that people were sometimes running together what turn out to be distinct projects.
Hmm.
And so I do think that there are some compatibilists who were writing very much in that mode, sometimes more and less self-aware about this. So I think Frank Jackson's version of compatibilism, he's upfront about this, where he says something like, look, here's a kind of construal what compatibilism is, but really, if you're being, but really maybe it's a kind of replacement notion. I mean, there are cases where people were acknowledging this, but I also think I think it's a mischaracterization of the bulk of a lot of 20th century compatibilists to represent them in that way. And the easy case
Hmm.
again is to think about the conditional analysis folks. Like that was clear. I mean, they're very explicit that this is, they're telling you what they think we mean and all we mean, right? And
Hmm.
that language even comes from T.F. Strawson about what we mean and all we mean
Hmm.
by these terms. And if you think about it against the background about the kind of, and this is one of these things where our grip on on philosophical method disagreements about philosophical methodology that are more than 30 years old, that I think we don't tend to think and teach and talk about these things in quite the same way, but it means that we lose a grip on why some of these projects were shaped in the ways in which they were.
Hmm.
So if you go back to the era of ordinary language philosophy, where part of what we were trying to do was to uncover the distinctions that already existed in everyday discourse, this is a broadly and generally an anti-revisionist picture. Or think about P.F. Strawson's descriptive metaphysics. So he's very explicit that he thinks that revisionary projects are just off the table. He thinks that
Yeah.
philosophy properly restricted has to be descriptive. So any kind of compatibilism that's getting constructed out of those as background metaphilosophical commitments can't be revisionist. It's just already off the table that you could go revisionist.
Hmm.
And similarly, if you have like to pick a more recent example, so Robert Nozick in Philosophical Explanations thinks, look, the task of philosophy is to explain how it could be the case, the things that we already think.
Hmm.
And again, this looks like if that's what you think we're doing, it's philosophical explanations is just kind of a defense of common sense or something like that.
Yeah.
Again, it's not clear what grounds there is for significantly revisionist projects. And in contrast, if you come out of a tradition of something like Quinean naturalism, where the thought is part of what we're doing in philosophical theorizing is being responsive to developments that are happening in the sciences and that we're continuous with those things, there I think that the impulse to broadly revisionary elements begins to emerge much more systematically. If you're committed to a kind of holism about the mind, it's going to emerge much more organically. And I think you see this in the kind of Quine, Goodman, Rawlsian strategy that yields this kind of reflective equilibrium thing, where you have folks who are in the normative ethical traditions taking it for granted that there's no such thing as a normative ethical theory that captures all the intuitions in all of the cases. Instead, what you have is a theory that is the best balance of compromises about principles and commitments and intuitions and so on.
Hmm.
And so that strand, folks who are in that strand, I think it's A, notice that they tend to be normative, and B, on the normative side of the story, and B, take the reflective equilibrium for granted. But where the shape of the metaphysical fights have been by people who are doing metaphysics oftentimes in a descriptive metaphysics mode, where the
Hmm.
test of a metaphysical theory is, can you get coherence with everyday discourse? Can
Yeah.
you explain away the kinds of conceptual distinctions that we have? And so it turns out, unsurprisingly, these ships pass each other in the night, and then there's just disagreement then about like how to understand what compatibilism is.
Yeah. No, you're making me realize that I was even more revisionist than I thought I was, and I thought I was a little bit revisionist. Because when I'm just kind of like thinking about, the first time reading any of these compatibilist works, like, Frankfurt's 71 paper where he talks about second order desires. I did read that, and obviously there was one sense in which it was a descriptive project because I sort of like I had my intuition pumped. Like I recognized, oh wow, that's a really clear way in which I think about things. But it also made me reflect on like that was it struck me at the time, and like I still like that view that like that is at least part of the way we should think about things too. So if I hadn't realized that, or like if I hadn't already agreed with it, like my thinking was inherently revisionist even though I didn't realize it at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, here, again, I want to be careful to not try to assimilate all of the versions of compatibilism that are out there, because I do think
Yeah.
that there are some versions of things that were called compatibilists that were clearly intended in a explicitly non-revisionist spirit.
Yeah.
And then there are things that I think where it's much more ambiguous about what way they are, so that maybe that the author sort of tacitly accepted the constraints of talking as though it was non-revisionist, even though they might well have accepted that come push to shove, if push comes to shove, maybe it's okay to be revisionist. And then other folks for whom they just took it for granted that that revisionist theorizing was something that you could go in for, especially for folks coming out of the kind of Rawlsian reflective equilibrium tradition. And so that it's something that is so common to how you do philosophy that it's not even worth the name as a distinctive methodology or as a possibility in conceptual space. And I think part of the contribution of the development of self-consciously revisionist theories to the wider debate is partly just to force some clarification about these kinds of things, so that what theories that oftentimes can look like they're at cross purposes might not have to be. I mean, we still have these questions about which substantively which theory should we at the end of the day adopt and why and so on. But I think one way to put it is that the old accusation that compatibilists are engaged in a wretched subterfuge. It might be wretched, but it's no subterfuge at all if you're a revisionist and you're telling them, look,
Yeah.
I am trying to offer you a replacement account of what I think of as a defective, broken, or otherwise imperfect way of organizing our understanding about these things. That's not a subterfuge.
Mm.
But I think but the reason why the insult had historical purchase was precisely because we weren't cautious about some of these distinctions.
Yeah. So in the time we have left, I want to give you a chance to talk about what type of theory you want us to revise too. So, because as you've pointed out in the book and in this conversation, just knowing that someone's revisionist doesn't necessarily indicate like what they want to revise our theory to. So, if I'm reading you in the book correctly, it seems like you sort of come out as a certain type of compatibilist, favoring what you say is um, the freedom relevant aspects of responsible agency is the agent's sensitivity to specifically moral considerations and the capacity of that agent to appropriately govern his or her conduct in light of those considerations. So, roughly speaking, sort of a moral reasons responsive compatibilist. Is that right?
Yeah, so good. So I guess I think here as there are different pieces here depending on where one picks up the thread. But I think in terms of how I think about free will, I think the right replacement notion of free will
Mm.
is a reasons responsiveness notion. And I do think it is a modestly revisionist notion because, of course, it turns out that this doesn't have to require anything like ultimacy or sourcehood in the sense that some incompatibilists have wanted, and that I think many of the kind of as it were ordinary competent users of their native languages would want when asked about free will or freedom of the sort that could explain or be a ground for things like desert and so on.
Mm.
So I do think it is a revisionist notion, but I do think it can do a lot of the heavy lifting that we need that notion to do, and it preserves topic continuity in various ways about organizing practices of differential praise and blame and holding to account and demanding responses or accountability and so on. And I think that's the sense in which I think there is topic continuity that warrants the thinking. It is a replacement for the old notion. It's not a change of topic, but I do think it is revisionist in the way in which I was sketching. And then the question is, why that notion as opposed to another notion? And there, I think we have to do a couple of different things. So one is just being able to show that it can do a lot of the work in the kind of everyday, ordinary, extensional contexts where we would want to appeal to a notion like free will. Did he do it of his or her own free will? When we presume that something like free will is operative in our accountability context, or can it explain the significance of deliberation, or there are these different kinds of things that we would want an account to do, and I think it does a pretty good job across the board on a lot of those sorts of things. But then there's a question about so why even hold on to this notion? And that's where I think a lot of the really interesting fights remain. I mean, that is why not go the kind of Paraboom or Caruso style route, where the thought is, and here I want to be careful because the Paraboom of 2022 is significantly different than the Paraboom of 2001, for example. But I think the old 2001 Paraboom, the suggestion was the discovery that we're not that we don't have agent causation. Incompatible state agent causation means that we've got to go in for massive abandonment of lots of our everyday accountability practices. And I think Caruso holds a view like that still today. I think Paraboom's walked back important parts about that, the really radical versions of that view. But I do think, put it against that view, the interesting challenge is, why not go that route? And then, and in contrast, the kind of revisionism I advocate for doesn't think that we are on the hook for massive or radical transformation of our practices, that it's relatively limited transformation of our practices. But then there are all of these intermediate positions available where you might imagine, well, maybe we get by better without blame practices at all. Maybe we get better, we can get by with certain kinds of blame, but not other kinds of blame. I think that's where a lot of the interesting work remains to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you sort of tease a little bit, I think, what you go into at greater length in building better beings, with your point about, sort of these reactions of like blameworthiness or praiseworthiness. They're not merely these like non-cognitive reactions that we have. They're also like this sort of call to like bettering ourselves, as the title of the book implies. Like they're calls to moral reform and like moral communication that are more than just sort of like brute, reactions of like, this thing is bad, so is that, I have not read is that 2013 was that book was published? I haven't read that yet, but having read this, I definitely intend to now.
Fantastic.
You've got me hooked. You'll get whatever the proceeds on your end are, like 5 cents from the Amazon purchase.
I'll take what I can get.
Yeah. I know we're coming up on the amount of time that I asked from you. So thanks really a lot for talking. This was a ton of fun. Just to close, I'm kind of curious on how you think we should actually go about revising people's beliefs, because I could imagine, someone listening to this, like really buying your thesis here. Yeah, we should really revise these notions, but sort of not being sure how exactly you suggest that we do that. Is it just listening to Plato's Cave, or is it more than that?
Yeah, everybody should listen to Plato's Cave. This is a great question for which I don't have the world's greatest answer. I don't know that I ever have the world's greatest answer, but here's an answer. So I do think that the shift from one way of thinking to another way of thinking is a diverse and disordered process. There are a lot of ways in which ideas that are right or fruitful, or maybe the next step to take in a kind of complicated history of an idea, even if it's not a final step, that those things can unfold in wildly different ways. And partly how and why they unfold is partly about the kinds of pressures on their unfolding. So one way to think about this is, it might be that it's enough, it's enough that physicists are clear on how simultaneity actually works, that it doesn't matter if lay people aren't clear on how simultaneity works. And so it just might be the case that it's, our folk notions of simultaneity, like it just, they're literally false, but it doesn't affect much at the level of practice. We can usually continue kind of roughly as we were. And if that's how the revision goes, then maybe it's important for philosophers to get clear on this. But and sometimes it might matter that other people aren't. I think about this in kind of like the kind of philosophy of time travel cases, right? So the fair amount of convergence that you can't change the past. The main consequence of the folk not believing it is that we get Hollywood movies where people can go back and change the past.
Yeah.
But that's the main cost for having it only be expert belief. But then there are other cases where there are some stakes to getting clear about this, and so sometimes the example I gave at the outset about transformations and how the understanding about culpability that was at the heart of criminal law. That did yield significant transformations about a kind of walking back from something like a strict liability system to an intention sensitive system, or a foresight sensitive system. And so I think, so sometimes those transformations can be really important. And then in other cases, maybe it's just an open question downstream to what extent and how much this matters and what uptake looks like. So sometimes the thought goes something like, the case of same-sex marriage in the US, where the thought was something like, no, this is just conceptually impossible. And a group of other people were like, no, it is conceptually possible. And it's really important that we make the shift. And then you can have a kind of critical moment. And how does that change happen? Well, even if philosophers, I don't know the full history about this, but even if philosophers were early to proposals about this as a conceptual possibility, the transformation of society doesn't happen just because people in the ivory tower are saying it. It's because everyday people are picking up and discussing, and you see examples in the media, and you watch Will and Grace, or you have a friend who, and so these kinds of things begin to move opinion in ways that can cause avalanche changes in social practices. And so I think, look to all the places where people change their minds about it. Women and daughters weren't property. Women and daughters should have the right to vote. People who aren't white landowners should have the right to vote. We have big, but these things are slow, and they involve lots of on the ground street fighting, as it were, or as my old teacher Ken Taylor used to say, it's the messy retail business of politics. And so I do think there might be some cases in which conceptual changes will require that, and I think it's open. It's an open question how much transformations in our concepts of responsibility and free will are going to entail or require engaging in those messy retail business of politics kinds of questions.
Yeah, definitely. Where can people find? I've already, recommended this book, which you can find a lot of places used for pretty cheap if you're trying to get into, this topic. But where can people find out more about your work?
So probably the Four Views on Free Will is as good as it gets for a straightforward intro access to a lot of these things, and has the tremendous advantage of having representatives of other views in the volume as well. So I think it's a great book in a lot of ways. My biggest attempt to try to work out these things in any systematic detail is Building Better Beings: A Theory of Moral Responsibility, and that was a 2013 book. And then you can check out my website for lots of articles of various lengths and various quality on these kinds of things.
Yeah, I'll include links in the description wherever people are watching or listening to all of those. So Manuel, stay on the line if you would for a second, but thank you so much. This was a ton of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Manuel. That was a ton of fun for me. And it really still just amazes me that, I can just reach out to these people who are super famous and super knowledgeable about the field that I'm interested in, and have them just agree to give me an hour of their time. It's pretty amazing, actually, to have that happen. So thank you again to Manuel for talking with me. And I hope that you enjoyed the conversation as well. So if you want to support me and the show in any way, you can do so primarily by sharing it. You can share it on Twitter, social media of any type. You can rate it on Apple Podcasts, like this video on YouTube, or subscribe via RSS feed or iTunes. You can review it there as well. You can discuss it on your own show or connect me with guests or recommend topics to cover. You can contact me at platoscavepodcast@gmail.com and get in touch with me or follow me on Twitter at Jordan_C_Myers. And you can visit my website as well, which is pretty recent, jordanmyers.org. And as always, thank you for listening, and keep struggling to escape the cave.